So our tutorial today, sorry, getting used to the microphone is a thing. Our tutorial today will have three different parts. The first one is advanced analytics entry points to talk about how you get into an analytics project and set yourself up for success. There are probably many ways you can think about an advanced analytics project. One way to structure it is with a series of data strategy and data-driven decision-making steps. So the data strategy steps set up your project for success, and then you move through the next steps. I'll touch briefly on the data strategy components now because they're relevant to part one of the tutorial, and then we'll walk through some of the other steps as they become relevant in the other parts of the tutorial. So the important parts of these components, the data strategy components, are setting up your project to be valuable, actionable, and successful. So successful meaning you make it to the end and you have a result, and nothing exploded. Valuable meaning that the company that you're working for or working with gets something out of it, and then actionable meaning that there's an actual action that is defined based on what your project is or what your results are. We'll go into those a lot more as we move through the tutorial. So the first step of data strategy is to define your corporate drivers. Defining corporate drivers allows an organization to prioritize projects based on potential business value and also establish a measurement or target for success. So if you don't know what drives your business, it's hard to figure out whether your results have gotten you further in that target. The next steps are strategy, organization, policies, procedures, and standards. And they help a business or an organization survey their current state, figure out where they are, and then set up a strategy, a plan for moving forward, and also consistency throughout the organization in terms of your other data aspects, so data stewardship, governance, storage, usage, processes, and security. In the center of this diagram, you'll see change management. Change management ends up central to the entire process. You can come up with the most brilliant, theoretically actionable solution, and if you can't actually implement it in the business, there's no point in having done any of the work. So of course you have to enter this process somewhere, so part one of this tutorial will talk about entry points. What is an entry point, you might say? This is basically asking where is the impetus for the project coming from? So we define a framework that's split in two different directions on two different axes. The first axis, going left to right here, has to do with where the interest in the project is coming from. On the left side of this axis, we have IT, and the right side is the business. We then split this space between top-down and bottom-up. So top-down impetus would be a sort of thou shalt do mandate from an upper level executive who has some interest in the business. A bottom-up impetus would be something more like a grassroots approach that's arising from someone who's actually dealing with a problem directly within the business and then bubbling it up. We've seen striking commonalities from projects that start from the same entry point. They have the same critical steps overlooked, they have the same critical steps deemed unimportant, and they often have the same issues arising throughout the project as a result. So to talk about those sorts of projects and commonalities and problems that might arise, we're going to walk you through some case studies that fall into all four quadrants of this structure that I've described.
And why top is on the bottom and bottom is on the top will become self-evident.
Yeah, the end.
Okay, so 4 case studies, which is obviously a super businessy approach. And if you hadn't clued in, this is business version of data science very specifically. If you're in academia and have no interest in going into industry, you can kind of think of this as like those really obnoxious grants that you sometimes get that you have to work with industry, because this is how we hope most industry are thinking about moving into this space. This is a few years in, more than a few now, years into consulting with a lot of different companies in various stages of applying data science, advanced analytics, whatever you want to call it, data mining, whatever, into their business. So these stories are kind of coming from a group of I'm going to say fairly typical situations that we keep running into over and over again that prove our point for the framework. One of the critical things that we should get into, and I want you to think about as we are talking about these stories, is the idea of a business driver. So it's really easy to think of getting into a project, at least in the industry space, where you have a rationale for the project. That's basically how you justified having a budget for the project. That's sort of like having a grant if you're in academia. But that's not necessarily, or almost ever, why you're actually doing the work. So the project driver is kind of this low level, we just had to explain stuff for budget reasons. Business drivers are at a higher level than that, and confusing the two or forgetting to talk about business drivers at all is a really critical mistake that people make when they're getting into this space. So before I jump into all of these, we're going to define business drivers as the overarching priorities that drive major business decisions. They are typically, I'm going to say typically internal, but they can be external or internal. External would be like competition, regulatory stuff. That's particularly true in the finance sector. Environmental reasons, sometimes societal, and in this space, often technological. Internal is where you typically see these projects arising, and that's efficiency, cost savings, new markets, new products, that kind of stuff. So let's jump in. We're going to start in the bottom, which is top down. Technology Directive. So this is the IT department or some high-level exec who is very IT focused has come to a conference and they did a bunch of like data science-y things, and then they come back and they go, you will do data science to the business, and they're just supposed to go figure it out. My favorite story about this kind of stuff comes from a large utility company that obviously I can't name. Don't ask. So their goal was to introduce advanced analytics as a core competency across the company. Their plan was that a whole bunch of different departments were going to send their really tough problems to this new little group in IT, and they were going to solve them magically with data science. To get this going, they started by talking to a tech vendor and decided that they were going to prove the technology by doing something cool as a pilot to demonstrate to all of those different business departments how useful this whole thing would be. Excuse me. So IT picked a department whose business decision-making process was very manual, on the belief that throwing it all into some high-techy fun stuff and throwing a bunch of machine learning algorithms at it would make it better, because it was a whole bunch of manual processes that were obviously just going to be made better by the introduction of a bunch of technology. That's like IT's dream, by the way, if you're on that side of the fence. And everybody believed that this was going to be a really good pilot because of that. They told the business their plan, and the business was like, sure, awesome, let us know when you have some results. And then the IT group called us in to start doing this work. So because the pilot was going to show how valuable this new competency was, anything that wasn't immediately or directly on the path to getting the pilot done was set aside. And that included all of the data governance and all of the business time that you might have otherwise. So we had no SMEs from the business. That's subject matter experts for those in academia who don't listen to our ridiculous business jargon all the time. And there was a lot of what I'm going to call tacit knowledge. Tribal knowledge would be the other term that people use here, with a lot of different interpretations of the same data depending on the departments that you were in and depending on which SME you happen to be. There comes a time in every project when you hit what we call a trigger point. That's the moment when you can either recalculate what you've been doing or the project gets shut down. And in this project, we got to a point where we had initial results for the pilot, and the business looked at those initial results, and they didn't match any of their reports. None of the data made any sense to them. It was completely out of the scope of what they had thought the project was going to be about. And so while everyone in the company was still more or less on board with the idea of the project, after this little snafu, they started to say, okay, but this technological proof that you're doing isn't actually very useful because we can't see how we're going to be able to do anything with it. It highlighted for us how, to get this right, the business was going to actually have to be involved in this process. This couldn't be something that the IT department was just going to present fait accompli to the business group. So in lieu of traditional lessons learned, which are usually like painfully obvious when people are presenting case studies, we're going to present the actual statements that people made during the course of this project that got us up to this point, and that you can use as sort of like red flags, so that if you hear statements like this in your projects, you should be stopping and reassessing where things are going and where you're coming from. Sadly, now we have heard these statements from multiple companies across the board. So they're I'm going to call them kind of quintessential red flag statements of projects in this particular entry point. So the very first one, and I'm going to apologize to those in the audience who are from a tech vendor, but the very first red flag in this space is when you get, our vendor is really confident with this technology. That's a huge red flag that you're trying to solve an IT problem and not a business problem. The introduction of technology without it having a business impetus is not useful in this space at all. Later on, when the deadline started to get tight, we also had lots of, yes, data governance is necessary, and we'll get to that after we've done the pilot and shown everybody how good this is going to be, the value of that technology. I'm going to make a stand right now. I promise that if you do this kind of work and you present it to a business with a results are or data is for demonstration purposes only in front of a business group, all you're going to hear from them is everything that's wrong in the data that you're looking at, because they cannot disassociate the presentation of results like that whole theoretical versus hard data side can't happen. So don't skip this. At the beginning of this project, the business gave us, I'm going to call them pseudo-encouraging comments like, I'm not entirely sure who's going to look at this, but I guess it'll be interesting. And sometimes stuff like, yeah, we're pretty sure it's not that easy. Those are also big red flag things. They typically mean in this space that the business thinks that the data is self-evident. IT department typically doesn't work with the data in the way that the business does. And more than anything else, when you're getting statements like this coming in from the business at the beginning of a project that has started in the IT group, you're not on the same page. So the end goal of the project is either not understood, not defined, misunderstood, or in this case, the end goal of the project is to prove the technology, which the business doesn't care about, ever. We also had lots of, well, we didn't schedule any time with SME whoever for that. So when you're getting into this kind of space and you start to realize that you need business time in the industry world, similar to academia, people are busy. And if you don't book their calendars well in advance, you don't get their time. If they're not assigned to a project, you'll never get to talk to them at all. So these kinds of red flags come up when you start in the IT department. Overall, missing these red flags leads to a lot of wasted effort and eventually rework. If we had asked this company at the beginning, what's your checklist to get this whole project done? It would have looked like this. This is cupcakes and kittens. That's like optimistic, happy thoughts about how this was going to work. The project drivers were to solve the IT problem and prove to the business how valuable the technology would be. And all of those nice statements that we just went through were signs that we should have used to go, stop. Instead, we hit that trigger point that highlighted how to get this whole thing on track. We were going to have to involve the business, and we'd have to go back to the business pretty much right from the beginning. And that's what we did. The very first thing that you should see on your checklist when you are getting into this space is involve the business subject matter experts. Absolutely critical. It's your first sign of success that the right people are actually at the table from the get-go. When we did that, it turned out that the business driver for the pilot even was to reduce product maintenance costs. That has nothing to do with proving the technology. Moving to that changed everything of the project. It changed the people who were on the project, it changed the focus, it changed the data that we were using. It even changed the analytical approach way down in the weeds. We moved from what could only be exploratory analysis because prove the technology doesn't have an algorithm to assign to it, and moved over to a really specific prescriptive problem. So that's when you start with the thou shalt do's from your IT department. Janet's going to slide you through what happens when you get from grassroots IT side.
Yes, so we call our second entry point the field of dreams. And as Danielle said, this is IT bottom up. So someone in the IT department sees a problem that they need to solve. So this story comes from a project with a healthcare provider. And in this case, the IT group actually initiated the project, and they did outline a number of goals. They first wanted to be able to answer questions that they couldn't currently answer. They wanted to bring together data from a number of disparate sources so they could do some analysis on it. And they wanted to, again, prove the technology, because this is still an IT-driven project. But their underlying goal, their bigger picture, or their ulterior motive, if you will, was to prove the technology in this department, and then as a proof of concept, and use that proof of concept to drive adoption across the entire organization, with that bigger project to be taken on by the larger governing body. It was like, we'll show them, and then they'll take it on and build it for everyone. So they did realize, to their credit, that a business question needed to be asked and answered, but as it turned out, the question that they asked and answered wasn't actionable. Now, don't get me wrong, the team was really thrilled with the results, and they were really able to ask and answer those types of questions, really, kind of lagging indicator questions, much faster and with a lot less rework than they were in the past, so that was great. But let's talk about what happened early in the project, and even more importantly, the reaction when the POC was actually wrapping up. So we had a couple of triggers with this project. The first one came when we asked to access their business SMEs again to get at the data governance aspects and to do the attribute mapping. Now, they weren't part of the project team, and no one had engaged them. The project was adjusted, to the credit again, to make this happen, but identifying the right subject matter experts to have in the room and getting them to the table was problematic. The second trigger came when the results were actually shown to the executive team, the executive steering committee. There wasn't a lot of buy-in from some of them, and in fact, the project stalled because of that. So as consultants, we rely on our clients to bring the right people to the table, and that can sometimes be a real challenge. With this client, we had full access to all the IT resources. We had the DBA, we had the architect, we had a couple of business analysts, but not knowledge of all of the data that we needed to be able to bring together and answer these questions. So some of the signs we heard along the way were things like, from the IT group, we have easy access to that data. So getting the data was easy. Understanding and interpreting the data, not so much. And then you heard, if we build it, they will come. Remember, their goal was to demonstrate value to the business through this proof of concept and get results to get buy-in to move forward. But as a result, the rationale and the project plan were focused on implementing the technology. And planned training was really only focused on the operations team, not on the business end users. And when we talked to the business, they were saying, I can't give you that definition. You need to talk to so-and-so. Because we really didn't have the right business SMEs. And we heard the implementation team saying, I can't get time with that subject matter expert. So we discovered there were really siloed pockets of knowledge in this organization. And the project planners didn't have the right business resources identified. And discovering who the true data stewards are, and I'm not saying the official data steward, but the people who really understand the data and the processes best, was time-consuming to be able to source them out. So as the initial phase of the project came to a close and the results were shared with the executive team, as I said earlier, the reaction was mixed. Some were really pleased with the results, and others were like, well, what happens if this information gets out? And why wasn't I involved? And as a result, the project really stalled. It looks like there is hope that it will be resurrected, by the way, but it's been stalled for a couple of years now. So when we looked at their checklist, it was more complete than Danielle's first story, but they still missed some key items. Remember, the project drivers were to prove the technology and bring together that data from the disparate sources. But the signs should have warned us that we didn't have the right business SMEs at the table. Things like if we build it, they will come, and what happens if this information gets out were definite indicators, were definite triggers. So even though we'd started with a business question, we had to go back to identify the right people to involve. So once we did, we determined the true business driver was to reduce the cost of critical interventions. And that changed the project from just understanding to actually producing actionable results. So that is our field of dreams. So IT-driven, bottom-up, grassroots. So Danielle's going to take you through the next one.
It doesn't always work that Janet works from the field of dreams lower up and I work with the exec down. It just happened that way for this talk. So ambitious executive is when the business person reads something like an article in the Harvard Business Review and goes, ooh, data science is a thing, we should do that. And they come back and they say, hey, Department X, go do data science. And they go, sure, okay. That's how you get into situations like this lovely custom analytics application, which was designed to support a new business strategy enterprise-wide. This is a large clothing retailer, and senior leadership decided that the critical goal was to ensure that everybody adopted this new business strategy. Full stop. They were going to replace a chunk of the business process with this new analytics-driven, fancy schmancy business process to this new strategy. The business strategy, they didn't want an input from anybody who they felt was stuck in the old way of doing things, which meant that no end users or SMEs below director levels were consulted for the entire project. In this case, the strategy was really clear. The analytics did actually align with the strategy, and after some super whacking, painful data stuff, even the results were very consistent. But when we went to user acceptance testing with the people who were actually going to use the application, almost to a person, they said that they found the results interesting and then ignored the entire application in favor of their old processes. Those SMEs and end users below the director level, they were finally able to actually see the application, and they did go through training, which was mostly focused on how to use the application, but not how to use it in their job. And no consideration had actually really been given on how to integrate this new business process into their existing business process. So they pretty much felt that this was an unnecessary step. It took a lot of time, it was a complicated application, had a bunch of fancy math in it, nobody really understood what was going on in it, and so they kind of said things like, we could check the results if we have to, but we're not going to change anything about what we decide to do anyway, even when we see these results. In this particular case, thankfully this is many years ago, early on in the movement to data science as a thing. In this case, it took another 2 years to get to a place where the end users were actually happy with the application. I won't put that in dollar figures, but it's a whack of money. So here are some of the things that we heard throughout the project that we should have used to stop and reassess and refocus that. Obviously, the first one is when the business says things like, you don't need to talk to the end users. That's just bad. Even weirder, it doesn't matter what our current metrics are because you're going to replace them wholesale with new fancy schmancy cool stuff. Plus, we don't really know what the new metrics need to be, but we have the strategy so IT can figure that out. Line that up with the data is self-evident, which is never true, never ever true. There is always one report or one person or one entire system or one database that interprets that obvious thing slightly differently, and that slightly differently, it's that time that it will matter. When you're doing something with data to drive adoption with a group of end users who know that data inside and out, then it really matters, that slight difference. From IT, we got, we're just implementing what the business tells us to do, even if it doesn't make sense to us. And yet, in that case, IT owned the metrics and KPI creation, and all of the documentation of those metrics. So those kinds of statements really signal disconnect. Disconnect like that is when the business asks for X, but really they want Y, and you end up, IT hears Z, and on and on and on. And N is the end delivered result that nobody wanted and nobody thinks is a good idea. Essentially, this is people aren't buying into the game plan, whatever that they think that game plan is. The implementation team spent a lot of time going, are we even sure this is what users want to have for here? And the entire company in this case had kind of a lack of faith that the IT department could solve this business problem anyway. A lot of IT projects were staffed off the side of the desk. In this particular project, there were a lot of really solid people across the implementation team who were involved, and most of them were convinced that this whole project wasn't going to work. This is similar to what we heard from IT. Again, this is the game plan needs to be clarified or created or changed, modified. In this particular case, most of that game plan needed to be scrapped. So the checklist for this project, their checklist, really was the best of the stories that we've seen so far, but it was missing some really critical steps. They had identified their business SMEs, just not at a level where anybody was actually doing the work, or even directly supervising anybody who was doing that work. In other words, the people whose jobs were going to change because of the result of this new process that we were putting in place, they weren't involved. So we had good business questions, all aligned with the business strategy, but we skipped over the part about making it actionable and went straight to presenting answers, because the project driver was to implement this new strategy and push answers out to everybody. Once we went back, sat down with the original SMEs, brought in all of these actual end users, we identified the business driver as improving the end user's buying strategy, which is not push new strategy, it's improve existing strategy, which had a tie to the focus that the original exec wanted to bring in, but it changed the focus of the application to making the insights presented actionable to those end business users. With that in mind, the end business users became a major part of the project. We figured out what the heck the actionable business questions really were, refocused the application on those actionable business questions, and we were actually able to make something work. That chunk of time and money in between was the unnecessary wasted space. So that's sometimes how you get, or where you go when it's top-down, thou shalt do from the business side, and not the IT side. Janet's going to go over our last quadrant.
Yeah, so our last story is a slightly different project from another retail company, and we call this entry point the smart competitor. So in this case, the finance department within a large regional retailer identified the need to run the company by the numbers. We've all heard the by the numbers. So the initiative focused on building a lot of dashboards to provide consistency in reporting those KPIs across departments, with the underlying thinking that the analytics presented would help identify inconsistencies between the processes, between the groups. So they quickly recognized that this initiative was much bigger than just finance, which was great. So they did structure the project to have representation from across the organization. They also recognized the need to invest in data governance activities up front. So the project plan was structured that way. There was significant investment in time spent understanding their inventory of data assets, unearthing some documentation, or in many cases creating new, because it just didn't exist, and building a common business vocabulary across the organization, which is really key if you're going to be presenting things at an enterprise level. So as a result, the initial project was a success, delivering dashboards to report on key KPIs, and additional releases expanded on that over time. So this project involved the right business subject matter experts, hooray, asked the right business questions using business drivers as their guide. But even with great projects, there are still a few things that you should watch out for. And here are some of the signs that may send the project off track if you don't address them. From the business statements like, we don't know what we don't know. There can be a lack of understanding of project scope. How many people have heard that? We don't know what we don't know. How many data assets did they really have? How much was really known about them? And this really forced some prioritization to avoid budget overruns. An assumption is that the meaning of the data, again, is self-evident, commonly used, standard business industry terms. We don't need a glossary. They needed to invest in building that common vocabulary, that common business language. From IT, things like, that's third-party software. We don't have a data dictionary. Sometimes the schema was really hard to surface in those cases or extremely abstract. And in some cases, it was deemed proprietary by their third-party software provider. And in the implementation team, we're saying, doesn't seem like they are very interested. There was some reluctance to participate from some of the data stewards and the subject matter experts. For many, there was a feeling of giving up control, especially when we were surfacing the myriad data in the spreadsheets that were all over the company. There was a lack of engagement with people, often those with the longest tenure at the company. They already know this stuff, and they can be resistant to change. So there was a bit of passive resistance surfaced as we went through the project. Now, their checklist was much more comprehensive than the other stories. And even though they did most things right, many things right, in fact, most, the project could have done a better job of actually checking back against your business drivers over the course of the project. It's really about making sure you're still in keeping with the overall goals of the organization as a whole. And really, the other key piece of this is ensuring that your C-suite, the CEOs, the CTOs, the CIOs, whoever they are engaged throughout the project, and you get buy-in for the initiative, especially if you want this to be a success and be a multi-release type of event. So their project driver was to be able to capture and report on key KPIs. The real business driver was to surface and resolve process inconsistencies across the organization. So with this driver identified, the project changed from just building operational dashboards to looking at processes that would impact those KPIs adversely. So that was our smart competitor entry point. And now Lindsay's going to tell you a bit more about our 2x2 framework.
Okay, so let's go over this framework again to help you place these different case studies in context. The x-axis, I'm so used to describing axes and where the data fall. The x-axis splits this whole space into quadrants that have to do with where the project was initiating in the business, so either from IT or from the business itself. And then the top and bottom spaces are split to top down, so a thou shalt do executive approach, or bottom up, so something coming from the end user, or people actually working with the business process itself. The case studies that we've presented have fallen in these 4 different quadrants, and clearly we have our favorites. So our least favorite are the technology directive projects. This is based almost entirely on the low likelihood that the project was conceived with the right people involved for success. These projects were the ones that are technology first. They're often around some technology that they want to implement. It's like a hammer looking for nails rather than a problem looking to be solved. And in these sorts of cases, you often need to reassess and go back to the beginning of the project and then set it up again before moving forward. Our second to least favorite, or if you want to be optimistic, our third favorite, are the field of dreams. So these are the ones that lack the right people involved in the business, and sometimes they lack the senior leadership to get things going, but at least they're usually more focused on a single business question. Our second favorite, a relatively happy face, is the ambitious executive. So these are the projects that have the right people involved from the beginning. They usually have good strategic alignment with the business drivers. But sometimes the insights are not actionable. So they might be interesting and relevant to the business and to the business drivers, but they're not necessarily connected to the people who need to actually put them into place to change that business process. Then the happiest of all happiest faces is the smart competitor. So these are the ones that are usually well-focused on actionable insight generation. You still, in this case, need to be, even if you have set your project up for success, you still need to be careful as you go and make sure that you consistently check in with your business drivers, because these projects can still go off the rails later in the project as people start following tangents or moving farther away down a path and not checking back to where they started. So if you're in the middle of one of these projects, ask yourself which entry point applies to you. If you are in one of, let me say, the closer you are to one of these quadrants that have a happier face, the better chance that your project will be set up for success from the beginning. The closer you are to one of these quadrants with a less happy face, the more chances, not that you will fail, but there are more things that you need to do to get yourself back on track. So in the next couple of slides, we're going to talk a little bit about what you can do to move back on track. In a few slides. So if you're starting a project, or if you're in the middle of a project and trying to get back on track, this is the whole checklist that we've gone through throughout these different case studies, and this is a way of figuring out how to set up your project. We strongly recommend that you follow these 9 steps, ideally in order, but if you missed one, you can go back and sometimes figure it out as you go. So the first one is identify the business subject matter experts. I have a lot of trouble saying SME, having not been ingrained in the business community for long enough, because it sounds a lot like Smeagol from The Hobbit. But that might be a way to remember it if you have trouble remembering that acronym. The second item on the checklist is to have these subject matter experts identify business drivers and then focus on those business drivers. So don't just have them in the room, have them actually help you move towards the business problem. The third item on the checklist is to identify business questions using those drivers as a guide. Then prioritize the actionable business questions. We'll be going into a lot of depth on that particular one. On those two, actually, identifying the business questions and then prioritizing them in the second part of this tutorial. It's then important to identify the required data, identify and engage your data stewards, choose your resources, both in terms of your technological resources and also the people who will be involved and working on this project. Create a data dictionary so that everybody is on the same page. That's another one that feels very familiar with academia. Identify and define your terms so we're all communicating properly. And then check back against your business drivers throughout. So the different case studies that Janet and Danielle went through earlier were missing different items on this checklist. The first one, the technology directive, didn't do item number 1, which is identifying the business subject matter experts. The field of dreams went a little bit farther. They did identify who should be there, but they didn't actually use those or involve those subject matter experts to identify the business drivers. So there's still a couple steps removed from the actual business problem. The ambitious executive failed to prioritize an actionable business question. So they had good strategic alignment to the business drivers, but they didn't have something that was actionable for the people who needed to implement the results. And then that last project, the smart competitor, did include all of the different elements on the checklist, but had trouble sometimes checking back against the business drivers throughout the project. So how many of you are involved in an advanced analytics project now or about to start one? Okay. Can you identify, if you can identify your entry point, I'm going to go through the 4 different entry points. No, not going for it yet. And see if you can figure out where you are in each of them. So can any of you identify yourself as being in the technology directive, top-down IT-based entry point for a project? Great, that's a lack of frowning faces. That's excellent. How about the field of dreams? So technology-based, but more bottom-up rather than top-down. Yeah? Great. We have some advice for you. And then we'd love to hear your feedback later. How about the ambitious executive? So top-down directive from the company. Okay, you're getting there. You're moving closer.
You can blame all of the Harvard Business Review articles on data science for that. That's where that comes from.
How about the smart competitor? So you feel like it's a business need bubbling up from the bottom, business focused, relatively on track. No, so there's a lot of the ambitious executives. One?
Yay.
Awesome. Great.
Congratulations, you can go home now.
So how do you avoid those trigger points that Danielle and Janet talked about? If you recognize them, if you see those red flags, you can then do something about it. So it's not necessarily terrible to see those trigger points because it means that you're paying attention to the project and you can then move forward. So in the next couple of slides, we'll go through different ways that you can try to pull yourself out of a bad situation and reassess and restart that project if you're just starting the project or if you're in the middle of the project and trying to get things back on track.
So, if you are, if your entry point is IT Topdown, our technology directive, and you're at the project start, it's all about those first two critical steps that we talked about. Be sure to identify your business needs and identify your business drivers. These are must-haves. Now, if you're in the middle of a project, you're somewhere midstream, then what do you do? How do you cope? Well, you can basically, some of the things you might do is discuss the resource gaps with your project sponsor or your project manager. We were missing these business subject matter experts. You should gather all the results that you've gotten to date and then engage the business SMEs in a workshop to basically review the results and then refocus on the actionable insights. So it may mean reframing some questions or coming up with some new questions, those types of things as you move forward. Now, if you are Field of Dreams and you're at the project start, again, these two steps are critical. And if you're already midstream, then how can you adapt? Well, you could talk to your business counterpart to garner support and participation. It's kind of grassroots to grassroots. We're working on this. Can you help me out? Identify your proper data stewards. And remember, I'm talking those unofficial data stewards, the ones who know the data and the processes best. And engage those people in workshops that focus on actionable insights. If you are the ambitious executive and you're at the project start, make sure you identify an actionable business question, and that's our next topic. But if you're midstream, make sure you talk to the end business users to best understand their processes and the fit for what you're answering. And then readjust the project based on findings. And if you're the smart competitor, the key thing here at Project Start is to make sure you engage your C-suite early. Make sure you've got that sponsorship and support, especially if you're looking at it from an enterprise-wide perspective, because in terms of pushing the results out to the enterprise, you need that kind of support there. And if you're midstream, just keep in mind to check back with your business drivers and your strategy so you don't go astray, and you can readjust the project if you need to. So Lindsay's going to wrap it up for us and take you into our first exercise.
Okay, so one of the key things that you should remember from everything we've been talking about so far is that you're solving the business problem first. You're not solving a technology problem. Technology is important. But it's only important after you understand your business drivers and after you know what question you're trying to ask. I think of this in the analogy of data science is really science for business. So when you start any science project, whether it's research science or natural sciences or data science, you need to know what your research question is. Once you know your question, you can define your hypotheses, and then you can start addressing it. It's the same thing for data science. Technology is a tool that you can apply to these questions, but the real thing at the root of all of it is what is your science question? So now that we've walked you through the framework for how we set up for success with advanced analytics projects, we're going to give you guys a chance to work together and practice some of these skills. First, we're going to split you into groups. I think there are about 24 people. We went groups of 4 to 5, so it'll be about 6 groups. So not right now, but in a moment, get up and sit close to other people so you can work with them. We're going to have 3 group exercises, one at the end of each of these parts. And hopefully you will work with different people for each of them. So if you like your team, that's great, but it won't move you around anyway. So I have here a whole bunch of case studies that I'll hand out once people are in groups. I non-strategically stapled them all together. So try to look at only the first case study, just like resist all of your scientific curiosity to move on to the next so that we don't reveal anything too early. The case studies for this part describe the beginning of an advanced analytics project. So it's somebody who is presenting a project from a business and talking to you as some sort of facilitator. So somebody working within the company or somebody who's a consultant who's coming in to work with that company. For each of them, we want you to do two things. First is identify which quadrant the project falls into. So just one of those 4 quadrants that we described earlier. We can put back on the slide that plot if that's a little bit easier. The second thing is think about if you need to adjust the track of the project, and if you do, what should you do to adjust the track? And I think, yeah, that's it for now. If you pick up on all of the super nerdy puns and all of the names and stuff, let's have coffee later. All right, so if you guys could group yourselves into groups of like 4 to 5 people, think about 6 groups, that would be fabulous.